everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe. And of course, don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week, we are going to be talking about a solved case from the state of Ohio. When a young teenage boy left his home one night and never returned, his concerned family immediately began trying to work out what had happened to him. However, the mystery surrounding his disappearance, well, it wouldn't remain a mystery for very long, as within less than 24 hours, his dismembered remains would be found, having been the victim of a vicious homicide. Despite police early on identifying a couple of potential suspects, his case tragically went cold and would remain unsolved for years and years. But then, more than 3.5 decades after the crime, new DNA techniques would finally advance the investigation and provide the detectives and the victim's family with an answer as to who had committed this heinous crime all those years ago. However, sadly, by the time the perpetrator was found, the heartbreaking reality emerged that getting justice would now be impossible. Join me as we delve into the disturbing case of Tony Muncy. But quickly before we get into the case, please listen carefully to the following. This video involves heavy themes such as sexual assault and paedophilia. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 4 decades now to the fall of 1983 in Columbus, which is the capital city of the state of Ohio in the US. And this is John Anthony Muncy. He was a teenage boy who lived in Columbus with his family. John Muncy, who mainly went by his middle name Tony, was just 15 years old at the time that this case occurred. He was born on the 7th of December 1967 to his parents John and Gladys Muncy, and I believe he was one of 5 children. I think he had 3 sisters and a brother, a younger brother who was actually also named John. Tony was a student in high school. He was in the 9th grade and he was said to have been very popular in school. He got along well with all of his peers. Tony just seemed to be a very kind of happy-go-lucky teenager. He was described by his loved ones as being very fun and full of life. He was outgoing. Tony's uncle David recalled how his nephew had one of those smiles that just lit up a room, and he was such a character, was Tony. His younger brother John described how he always very much looked up to Tony as a big brother, always idolized him. Tony was very passionate about all things music and rock and roll. He especially loved the bands Kiss and AC/DC. And to be honest, there isn't much more information about Tony and his life online that I could find, really. I do know that he had just started dating a new girlfriend shortly before this case took place. He was working hard in high school. He just seemed like a very kind, friendly, typical teenage boy living in Columbus, Ohio. And at just 15 years old, I mean, the world was his oyster. He had his whole life ahead of him, or at least that was until his future, his life, was cruelly snuffed out when in October of 1983, Tony Muncy just suddenly disappeared. The date was Saturday the 15th of October 1983, a day that started as being a very good one for the Muncy family. Tony was at home for most of that day, I believe, as his parents had actually organised for a photographer to come to their address and just take a load of pictures of the family. So Tony and his siblings all dressed up really nicely. They had these photos taken, including these pictures on screen right now. And then later that day, in the early evening of the 15th, Tony asked his father John if he could borrow some money because, as I mentioned, he had a new girlfriend and I think she lived like a bus ride away from him. So he wanted a little bit of money to be able to catch the bus and go and visit her for a few hours. His father John said yes, he gave his eldest son a little bit of cash for the bus, and at around 4:30 p.m, Tony said goodbye to his family and he left the house. And of course, his parents were expecting to see him later that same night when he eventually returned home. They were none the wiser that in fact that would actually be the last time they would ever see their son alive again. Like I said, they were expecting Tony to be home just later that same evening. However, his parents, John and Gladys, were waiting and waiting for him to walk through the door, and he never did. He never returned. Now, I don't think they massively panicked straight away. I mean, they were a little bit concerned, don't get me wrong, but apparently they did have some family friends who lived nearby, and so their initial thought was, oh, maybe Tony decided that he was going to stay with them for the night, and so that's why he hadn't come back. However, when the following following morning, Sunday the 16th of October rolled around, there was still no sign of their 15-year-old son, and they also learned that no, he hadn't stayed with family friends the evening before. They had no idea where he was. No one had any clue where Tony was, where he had gone, and obviously this was a time before everyone had mobile phones, so it wasn't like they could just call him to find out where he was. Naturally, as each hour ticked by with still no sign of their son, the concern felt by Tony's parents was just increasing and increasing, and tragically it completely skyrocketed when they heard the news later that same day that the body of a young man had just been found. At around 8 a.m. that Sunday morning, two deer hunters, were looking for deer along this wooded area by the side of South Galena Road in Galena, Delaware County, Ohio, about 25 miles away from Columbus, where the Muncys live. Anyway, these men were walking around in search of deer, and as they were doing so, they spotted in the distance what they thought looked like some plastic trash bags, about 5 trash bags in total, and so the hunters decided to walk towards them, and that was when they made a truly gruesome discovery. They actually noticed that sticking out of one of these trash bags was a body part, a human body part. It was a human leg. Inside of these trash bags were dismembered human remains, which had just been dumped on the side of South Galena Road. So horrified, the deer hunters called the police, who soon arrived at the scene, and sure enough confirmed that yes, it looked like there was a human body in these bags, and that wasn't all. Also found in these bags were things like towels and gloves which were covered in blood. There was also this gold necklace and a knife and some blood-stained men's clothing. Quite a lot of clothing, actually. There were some men's trainers, a blue denim jacket, a checked shirt, and then 3 different pairs of pants or trousers, which were different sizes, actually. I think 2 of the pairs of pants were one size and then the other was a smaller size, which led the police to theorise that perhaps they actually had more than one victim here. I mean, like I said, they hadn't found, I suppose, a body in one piece. They'd found several dismembered body parts in these bags. So yeah, maybe they had come from more than one person, hence the 2 different sizes of pants. However, ultimately, when these bags and these remains were sent to the coroner, it was established that no, the body parts in these bags had made up just one body, believed to be the body of a teenage boy who must have only died very, very recently, within the last 24 hours or so, as there wasn't really any decomposition yet. It was thought that the smaller pants in the bag were probably the victims, so perhaps the other 2 pairs of pants, the larger ones, were the perpetrators. Of course, this was a homicide. The victim had been mutilated and again cut up into several different pieces. I believe his arms had been cut off, his legs, his head was basically decapitated, his torso had been cut. I mean, it was just horrendous, truly sickening what had happened to this young man. And during his autopsy, the coroner was able to conclude that he had been murdered via stab wounds to his body. If you recall, also found in the trash bags was a knife, and this knife was confirmed to have been the murder weapon. The victim had been stabbed with it 3 times in total. He had 1 stab wound in the front of his neck and the other 2 were in his back. And I did actually read on one source that the knife, the murder weapon, was still sticking out of his back when his body parts were found. What also became clear during the autopsy was that the victim had put up one hell of a fight against the killer. He had cuts and bruises all over his hands from where he had tried to defend himself, but unfortunately he stood no chance really, given the fact that the perpetrator was armed. And after he was dead, that was obviously when his body was dismembered and stuffed into these bags. Now, it didn't appear as though the attack had taken place in the area where his body parts and the bags were found, as there was no sign of like a disturbance or a violent struggle, no blood on the ground or on the roadside. So it seemed as though he had been killed elsewhere, and then his remains were brought to this location and just dumped. And unfortunately, the contents of the bags offered up no clues as to who the victim actually was. Amongst the clothing, they didn't find an ID or anything like that, so the police knew that figuring out his identity might prove difficult. But in an effort to do so, the police turned to the public. Later that same day, on the 16th of October, they put out a media appeal letting the public know that the dismembered body of a young man had been found in Delaware County, and they also put out a description of the clothing that was found in the bags alongside the body. body, thinking that maybe someone would recognize some of the clothing and come forward. And someone did. That evening, a mother from Columbus, Ohio, contacted the police after seeing this appeal as her teenage son was currently missing. And some of the clothing that the police described he had been wearing the last time that she saw him. This woman, this mother, was of course Gladys Muncy. She was concerned that the body of this teenage boy may have been her son, 15-year-old Tony Muncy, who, as we know, left his address to go and visit his girlfriend just the evening before and never returned. So upon receiving this information, the police asked Gladys Muncy to come down to the coroner's office and identify whether or not the victim was her child. And sure enough, he was. It was Tony, who had been brutally stabbed, cut up, and then just dumped on the side of the road like he was trash, leaving the Muncy family absolutely heartbroken. It was devastating for them, as you can imagine. They couldn't understand why this had happened, why someone had done this to Tony. Who on earth would have wanted this loving, friendly young boy dead? Well, that was obviously a question for the police to figure out the answer to. A murder inquiry was launched and the hunt began to find Tony Muncy's killer. Now, in order to piece together Tony's last movements, get a clearer picture of the timeline here, they took statements from everyone in his life, his friends and his family. His family members were of course able to tell the police that they'd been taking family pictures that day and that Tony had left the house around the early evening to go and catch a bus to see his girlfriend. But he never made it. He never made it to this meeting with his girlfriend. So at some point along his route, he'd obviously been abducted and killed. Perhaps he'd been abducted at knife point, threatened to get into a car and taken elsewhere and killed. Or maybe he got into the killer's car willingly. Perhaps the perpetrator offered him a lift and Tony happily accepted. Of course, completely unaware of the driver's true sinister intentions. As I said, the police also spoke to friends of Tony Muncy's, a couple of which were actually able to inform them that they had seen Tony on the night that he disappeared and was murdered. The night of the 15th of October, they recalled having seen him, must have only been shortly after he left his house, standing on his own outside the nearby York Plaza Cinema, which was close to the bus stop. So it seemed as though that was him on his way to the bus stop that night. Now, we know that he never made it to his girlfriend's house, but what the police couldn't establish was whether he'd actually gotten on the bus or not. Of course, this was before CCTV. There wouldn't have been CCTV cameras on the bus or anything, and there didn't appear to be any witnesses who could say whether or not Tony had gotten on the bus. So detectives weren't quite sure if he was confronted by the killer at or near the bus stop, or when he'd gotten off the bus at the other end, at his destination or something. But this sighting of him outside the York Plaza Cinema was the last time he was ever seen alive. After speaking to Tony's friends and family, it didn't appear as though there was really anyone in his life that would have had a motive for wanting him dead. I'll say it again, but he just seemed to be a very, very nice, happy-go-lucky, typical teenage boy. He didn't have any enemies, so it was looking likely that the murderer was probably a stranger to him. Following the launch of their murder investigation, the detectives continued to appeal to the public for information in Tony's case, and they were following up on tips and leads, and they did receive a couple of tips which the police thought may have been significant. Basically, a good few people got in touch with the authorities saying that they'd actually overheard the same man confessing, bragging almost, to being responsible for the murder of Tony Muncy. That man was named Timothy Hall. He was around 18 years old back in 1983, and he was someone with a history of severe mental health issues. I think he may have been a patient in a mental health institution at one point. And actually, by the time he was identified as a suspect in Tony Muncy's case, a couple of months after Tony was killed, Timothy Hall was already behind bars. He'd been arrested and I think was awaiting court proceedings for another crime. Would you believe it? Another murder. Just 2 months after this case occurred, in December of 1983, Timothy Hall was arrested for the murder of a 50-year-old blind man named Hubert Campbell. The two did know each other. They both lived in the same neighbourhood, and in fact, Hubert had actually shown Timothy Hall a lot of kindness prior to his death. From what I can gather, Timothy Hall may have been homeless at the time because he'd knocked on Hubert Campbell's door on a few occasions, and Hubert had always let him in because he felt sorry for him and he didn't want to kick him out because it was December and it was freezing outside. And in return, Timothy Hall brutally murdered him. He turned up at Hubert Campbell's address in the early hours of the 2nd of December 1983, and once inside, he launched the most gruesome attack on Campbell. He bit Campbell on the head, started beating him with a table leg. He poured hot coffee all over Campbell, even pouring it down his pants, and then he grabbed a knife and began stabbing him over and over again. Hubert Campbell suffered about 20 stab wounds in total and 42 blows from the table leg, I believe, and he bled out and he died on his living room floor. The police very quickly identified Timothy Hall as being the perpetrator. He was quickly arrested and pretty much instantly confessed to the crime. During his confession, he even said to the officers, quote, "I don't regret doing it. It was a new experience and I loved it." He was later convicted of Hubert Campbell's murder and sentenced to life in prison. But as discussed, he also became a suspect in the Tony Muncy case, as members of the public reported to the police that prior to his arrest, he had been going around and confessing to people that he had killed Tony too. And detectives did really believe that this could have been true. He could have been Tony's killer. Apparently, there was some speculation that Tony and Timothy may have actually known each other, although I'm not sure if that was ever confirmed. There was also speculation that the shirt, the blood-stained check shirt that was found alongside Tony's body parts in the trash bags, may have been Timothy Hall's. According to one of Hall's acquaintances, he did own a shirt that was incredibly similar. So it did appear as though there may have been some circumstantial evidence here tying Timothy Hall to the crime. However, when the detectives went and questioned him behind bars in relation to the Tony Muncy case, he completely denied it. He said that he wasn't the one who had committed this crime, which seemed interesting. Timothy Hall didn't really seem like the type of criminal who would deny much. Like I said, he'd openly admitted that he'd murdered and essentially tortured Hubert Campbell, so why confess to that crime and give every gory detail and not this one if he was involved? He also denied knowing Tony Muncy, denied that the shirt found in one of the trash bags was his, and to be honest, despite the police's suspicions, there was no solid concrete evidence linking Timothy Hall to Tony's homicide. And so whilst he wasn't ruled out as a suspect, he was kind of put on the back burner for the time being. He was always in the back of the detectives' minds as a person of interest in this case, but also due to the lack of evidence, they were forced to carry on and continue looking into other people too. And as it would turn out, Timothy Hall wouldn't be the only viable suspect in this investigation. Another man named William Wickline also became of interest to the detectives, and he was quite a similar suspect to Timothy Hall, to be honest. By that I mean he became a suspect in a similar way. It was because he'd also been allegedly going around telling people that he was the one who killed Tony Muncy, including his own girlfriend. He confessed the crime to her. And upon looking further into William Wickline, detectives realised instantly that he was definitely someone who could have been capable of committing this crime. You see, William Wickline was actually a serial killer from Ohio. Between 1979 and 1982, he carried out at least 3 murders. It's possible that he may have been responsible for even more, but 3 victims is the confirmed number. In November of 1979, he murdered a 34-year-old man named Charles Morgan Marsh, and then a couple of years later, in August of 1982, he murdered married couple Christopher and Peggy Lurch, and his murders were so vicious and so brutal that he was dubbed the Butcher serial killer by the media. So, for example, with his first victim, Charles Morgan Marsh, he actually decapitated him, and then he placed his severed head just on his nightstand whilst the rest of his body lay on his bed. With Christopher and Peggy Lurch, they were also decapitated and dismembered, and then Wickline hid their bodies in plastic bags and scattered them across Franklin County in Ohio. He would just go around putting them in in different garbage bins, and I believe I read that their remains were never actually found. So as you can tell, there were a lot of similarities between Wickline's previous murders and the murder of Tony Muncy. He'd also been dismembered and his body parts hidden in plastic trash bags and then dumped. And apparently at the time of Tony's killing in October of 1983, Wickline was known to have been in the central Ohio area where Tony lived and disappeared from. As I mentioned, he had allegedly confessed Tony's murder to his girlfriend, and she would later go on to tell the police that Wickline had told her that the reason he did it, the reason he killed Tony, was because Tony had witnessed him carrying out another crime that night. Wickline claimed that that night, the night of the 15th of October 1983, he was in the process of carrying out a burglary at a drugstore in Columbus, Ohio, and he noticed this young man walking down the street who had obviously spotted him. This young man was Tony Muncy, and Wickline panicked. He didn't want to be caught for committing this burglary. He was worried that Tony was going to call the police and identify him, and so he decided in that moment that he was going to kidnap and kill him. He threatened Tony at knife point, forced him back to his address, and it was there where he stabbed him to death and dismembered his body. So the police went to speak to William Wickline whilst he was in prison about this confession to Tony's murder. However, he denied it. I think he basically said that his girlfriend was lying, he hadn't admitted to this crime, he didn't kill Tony Muncy. And unfortunately, once again, even though he seemed like a very viable suspect in the police's eyes, there just wasn't solid evidence to link William Wickline to the killing, and so they couldn't do anything. They couldn't charge him. Just like Timothy Hall, he was still very much considered a good person of interest in Tony's case, but yeah, without evidence, police were powerless to do anything. And tragically, it was following this when the case of Tony Muncy started to go quiet and ultimately go cold. Years and years started to pass by with no arrests made and no justice whatsoever. Now, around the early 2000s, so well over a decade and a half after Tony's death, that detectives actually decided to go and speak to William Wickline again about Tony's case. You see, Wickline was obviously still in prison for the other murders that he had committed, and in fact, he was awaiting execution. He'd been sentenced to death for his crimes, and I think his execution date was looming. So detectives working on Tony's case thought, well, why don't we just go and speak with Wickline again to see if we can get a confession? You know, he's on death row, he's not got long left. Maybe now, years and years after the crime, he would be willing to actually confess to Tony's murder to get it off his chest, I suppose, before he died, if he was the one responsible. So they did just that. They went to speak with him in prison, and his interview was a little bit confusing, to be completely honest. So I think initially he just continued to deny it. Denied killing Tony, and he would get quite defensive in his tone. He didn't like the fact that the police were accusing him once again. But then the detective started bringing up Tony Muncy's family. She was saying things to Wickline like, you know, his family have gone all these years without knowing who had done this to him, and they deserve answers. So if you can give them those answers, then you should. And oddly, Wickline then started saying things like, oh well, okay, just say that I did it then. Tell them that I did it if you think it will help give them some form of closure. But then he quickly retracted this and maintained that actually, no, he was not responsible. So the police didn't really get anywhere with that interview. Again, they didn't have that concrete proof, solid evidence to prove that he was involved. And even if he was, he would never be convicted of it now, because on the 30th of March 2004, William Wickline was put to death via lethal injection. Unfortunately, following this, once again, Tony's case started to go cold. The investigators just didn't really have much to go on. The tips and the leads had practically all dried up. I mean, the Muncy family never gave up. They never stopped their search for answers. Over the years, they continued to contact the police department asking for updates. Particularly Tony's younger brother John, he was always ringing to ask if there were any developments in the investigation. He refused to give up, like I said. Refused to give up hope that one day his brother's killer would be caught. And it was in 2010, I believe, when Tony's cold case was kind of reopened, and it was being led by Detective Dan Otto with the Delaware County Sheriff's Department. Obviously, by this point, by 2010, it had been about 27 years since Tony's Tony's murder, and there had been a hell of a lot of advancements in DNA and forensic science, which the authorities didn't really have at their disposal back when this case occurred in 1983. So Detective Otto was hopeful that perhaps these advancements might finally provide the police with the identity of the perpetrator. Detective Otto worked on Tony's case for about 2 years before he himself tragically passed away at just 38 years old. According to online sources, he sadly died in a car accident in 2012. But before he passed, he'd actually gotten a load of the old evidence in Tony's case out of storage, and he sent it off to the science lab for testing. So this included the items that were found alongside Tony's body parts in the trash bags, like the knife and the gold necklace and the towels and the clothing. Detective Otto was hopeful that scientists might be able to find traces of the murderer's DNA on some of the evidence, and thankfully they had a breakthrough. So as we know, as we discussed earlier, a lot of the evidence was heavily bloodstained. The towels were covered in blood, the clothing was covered in blood, and of course most of this blood was the victim's. It was a match to Tony's blood type. However, luckily, scientists discovered a second blood type on this clothing, type A blood, so they strongly believe that this was the killer's blood, likely from where the killer had injured himself during the attack. Perhaps the knife slipped and cut him whilst he was stabbing Tony. So the blood was examined by scientists, and they were successful in extracting a DNA profile from it. After all these years, all these decades, they finally had the DNA profile of the offender. They could now use this to test against potential suspects. As soon as the detectives obtained this DNA profile, it was immediately entered onto the CODIS database, the National DNA Database, in search for a match. However, unfortunately, there wasn't one. No matches, which actually was shocking for the investigators, because this meant that the two prime suspects in the case were actually innocent. I mean, innocent of this crime anyway. Both Timothy Hall and William Wickline's DNA was on CODIS because, as we know, they were both convicted criminals, convicted killers. And yet when the DNA of Tony Muncy's killer was uploaded onto CODIS, neither of them flagged up as a match. All these years, police believed that one of these two men was the likely killer, and this finally proved that they weren't. Despite both allegedly confessing, neither of them had committed this crime. So then who had? Following this revelation, the search began for other suspects in the case that they could compare the DNA to. So detectives dug out Tony's case file from 1983. They started going through all of the names that had ever been mentioned in connection with the investigation, all of the men, and they began approaching them all these years later, asking them for their DNA sample and sending them off to the lab for comparison. Apparently they took more than 70 DNA samples in total, but frustratingly, again, no match, and eventually they kind of ran out of people to test, to be honest. This was just a dead end. And so in 2018, with limited other avenues to go down, detectives decided to turn to a relatively new DNA technique called forensic genealogy, which is the process of trying to find relatives of a person using their DNA profile. Investigators had heard about other decades-old cold cases from other states which had finally been solved using this kind of science, and so they wondered if it could help advance Tony's case too. If they couldn't find an exact match to Tony's killer's DNA, could they find a familial match instead? They got in touch with Parabon Nanolabs, who have been mentioned a number of times on this channel over the years. They are a company who specialise in genetic genealogy, and they agreed to help in this case, see what they could do. They took the DNA profile of Tony Muncy's killer and they began scouring public ancestry databases to see if they could find potential relatives of the perpetrator. And according to one article, it took them about 18 months in total, but eventually Parabon were able to build a family tree and narrow down the search for the killer to one of 3 brothers. They strongly believed that one of these brothers was the man who killed Tony Muncy all those years ago. So detectives immediately started looking into these brothers, and actually they were able to eliminate 2 of them pretty quickly, so that left just one. The third brother, the brother who was looking to be the likely murderer, was named Daniel Anderson. So police started delving a bit more into him and his background. They found that back in the early 80s, he both worked and lived in Ohio, relatively near the crime scene, near South Galena Road where Tony's body parts were dumped. According to reports, he would have been around 30 years old at the time of Tony's murder, and he definitely seemed like someone who would have been capable of carrying out such a sickening crime. You see, what the detectives would soon discover about Daniel Anderson was that he was a paedophile, a convicted paedophile. He had a violent history of sexual assault towards young boys, towards children. Now, I couldn't actually find much more information than that about his crimes online. Sources don't really go into specifics, into details, like how many boys he is known to have assaulted, but he did go to prison for his crimes at one point. So you may be wondering, well, if he had gone to prison, if he'd been convicted, then why wasn't his DNA profile on the DNA database when detectives searched it for a match to Tony's killer? Well, lucky for Daniel Anderson, he ended up being released from prison just before it became a legal requirement in his state for convicted criminals to be entered onto the CODIS system. So he just about dodged that. So now the police finally had a new top suspect in this case decades on, and what they wanted was a DNA sample directly from Daniel Anderson himself to be able to compare against the DNA of Tony's killer, because yes, they had a familial match, the familial link, but that wouldn't be enough. They needed a definitive match in order to move in and arrest him. However, detectives were hit with a massive blow when they discovered that getting a DNA sample directly from him would be impossible. Arresting him for this crime would be impossible because Daniel Anderson was actually dead. And he'd been dead for about 7 years by this point. By the time he was identified as a suspect, it was like early 2020, and he died back in 2013 at the age of 60, I believe of natural causes. So how were the police going to get his DNA? Daniel Anderson didn't have any children. His parents had passed also by this time. You know, it's unlikely that 7 years after his death, they would find an item or an object that would have his DNA on, like a hairbrush or a toothbrush. So it seemed like obtaining a sample of his DNA was going to be a struggle. However, detectives did discover that actually shortly before his death, that Daniel Anderson was having treatment in hospital, I think for cancer, because they performed a biopsy on him. And would you believe it, 7 years on, the hospital still actually had his biopsy on file, which was a miracle for the detectives. They could use this biopsy to get his DNA and compare it against Tony's killer. And sure enough, when they did this, when his biopsy was sent to the lab for testing, of course it was a match. Daniel Anderson was an exact match to the DNA of Tony Muncy's murderer. He was the killer. Finally, after about 37 years, police could provide the Muncy family with the answers they had been so desperately seeking for decades. But it's just so heartbreaking that Daniel Anderson was never going to face justice now. He was never going to face punishment for what he had done to Tony all those years ago, stealing his life in such a cruel way because he himself was dead now too. But Tony's younger brother, John Muncy, has said that despite this, they are still just so grateful that they finally know the identity of the man who murdered Tony back in 1983. And he also says that he feels sympathy for the family of Daniel Anderson. He feels sorry for them, that they essentially lost someone too, lost someone that they thought they knew, because he turned out to be such a monster, an incredibly evil individual. I actually have a quote here from John Muncy. He said of the news that Tony's killer had been identified, "It means the world to my family. He'll never go to jail for this crime, but the biggest thing is we all know he'll never hurt another person again. There are 2 families who are hurt in this, and I hope this is something they can find closure on themselves." He also praised and thanked the detectives who had worked on his brother's case over the years for never giving up the search for justice. Of course, because Daniel Anderson is deceased, the police and the Muncy family were never going to know exactly what happened that fateful night back in October of 1983. They were never going to know the events leading up to Tony's murder, because the only two people who can tell us, Tony and Anderson, are not here anymore. But it's been theorized that Daniel Anderson probably saw Tony Muncy walking alone along the street whilst Tony was on his way to meet his girlfriend. We know that he was sexually attracted to young boys, and he saw this as an opportunity to attack. Perhaps he forced Tony into his vehicle at knife point. Maybe Tony got in willingly after Anderson offered him a ride or something. We don't know. But it's believed Tony got into Anderson's car, was likely driven back to Anderson's apartment, and it was there where he was brutally murdered, stabbed to death. From what I can gather, Tony hadn't been sexually assaulted by his killer. Nothing online states that he was, but it's likely that that was Daniel Anderson's aim here, his motive. Maybe he tried to rape Tony, but because Tony put up such a fight, he proceeded to just kill him, dismember his body, and then obviously dump his body parts in that area on South Galena Road, along with the bloodstained clothing and Tony's gold necklace. That was the police's kind of theorized version of events. Again, we'll never know for sure what happened, but again, at the very least, the Muncy's family did have some form of closure with finally having the knowledge of who the perpetrator was. Going back to Tony's gold necklace that was found in the trash bags alongside his remains, that was actually returned back to the Muncy family in 2020 once his case was finally solved and closed, which, as you can imagine, meant a lot to them to have that necklace, to have that small piece of Tony back after all these years. And that concludes this case, the tragic case of Tony Muncy, whose life ended far too soon. He was just 15 years old, barely even a teenager, when his life was snuffed out by a twisted sexual predator. It was heartbreaking. But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. And also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Again, you can pop them down below in the comments, or alternatively you can go through my case request form, which is always linked in the description box of every single one of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye.